IVM.
Last week, one of the holiest places in the world became a site for the worst confrontations between Israel and Palestine in decades. In the latest escalation of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, it has killed 130 Palestinians and wounded nearly 1,000 others, as on 15th May. Israeli airstrikes toppled most of a massive high rise building in central Gaza City, and it killed a string of senior Hamas military figures. Meanwhile, Hamas, the Islamist group that rules Gaza and its allies, continued to fire rockets into civilian areas across central and southern Israel. With no resolution in sight, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to expand the Israeli offensive, saying that it will take time. Hamas has called for a full scale uprising. Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and every week on the show, I talk about important issues in global affairs and foreign policy. The Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the longest and deadliest in the world, but it's caught up in historical, colonial, and religious contexts. So, what started the conflict between Israel and Palestine? How do religions play a role? How do people pick sides? These are deeply political and personal questions. And I think my guest for today definitely has one way of thinking about them. Mayuri Mukherjee is a doctoral candidate at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. Her research focuses on the global governance of emerging military technologies. Previously, Mayuri was a journalist in India. She's also held consulting positions with the Ministry of External Affairs in India and with think tanks in Europe and Israel. Just a note, the Israel Palestine conflict is deeply contentious, and there are many ways of thinking about it. Mayuri gives us one side of the issue, and I hope to get other guests on the show who will walk us through the other sides in the weeks to come. So we'll take a short break and get to the conversation with Mayuri Mukherjee.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, thewholetruthfoods.com, and Seat Tires. We really do appreciate the support. So the last year's been tough for all of us, and the second wave of COVID really hit us badly. To help those affected by the pandemic in India, the podcasting community has come together under the Pod for Change banner to raise funds through an exclusive NGO partner, Give India. Join IVM and Pod for Change as we look to make a positive impact in the life of those affected by COVID-19. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and remember, somebody could really use the help. And now back to the promo. On the Simplified podcast, the gang explains the oxygen crisis happening in the country and tells us the various measures being taken to tackle it. On States of Anarchy, Hamsini Hariharan talks about how the geopolitical relationships shaped COVID response and the world order. As Indians, we're all familiar with acid reflux or heartburn, given the spicy food we consume. On The Habit Coach, Ashton has some simple solutions to counter that. Osama Moria explores the iconic neighborhood of Dadar and tells us its connection to outer space in Postcards from Nowhere. It was Dangle time on The Fighting Goat, as hosts Somesh and Arjun were joined by unbeaten MMA fighter and Commonwealth gold medalist Ritu Fogart. The traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh shares examples of various innovations that came up during the COVID times and helped us deal with the situation. And with that, let us get you back to your show.
Hi, Mayuri. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Hamsini. It's a pleasure to be here.
You just said right before we started recording that sirens were going off across the city where you're living. So what is happening? Why are there sirens going off in Jerusalem?
So actually, I'm in Jerusalem. Sirens went off in the center in Tel Aviv when I was on the phone with a friend, and there was a lot of confusion from that. So, but yes, just as we were about to start the meeting, sirens went off across the center, Tel Aviv, Rishon, all the big cities that are in central Israel. Sirens went off because Hamas launched rockets towards these cities. Hamas has been launching rockets constantly, nonstop, into Israel over the past 3 days, mostly in the south, but in the cities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Sderot, but also in the center. And this is where things have been unlike previous years or previous rounds of conflict, where it's been central cities are occasionally get hit, but not as much, because obviously, from the Israeli side also, it's one thing if you hit Sderot, it's quite another if you hit Tel Aviv, quite another if you hit the airport and the government has to shut down the airport. I mean, even now, if I'm not, as of today also, there are no arrivals, only departures. So this is not something that the Israeli government likes. It really places a lot of value in putting out the fact that Israel is a safe place, that we don't, that terrorism and the conflict in general does not affect day-to-day life within Israel. But when it does, especially in cities like Tel Aviv, this is a huge escalation. So usually, even when Hamas launches rockets every now and then, it's in the southern cities, but when it comes to the center, that's a major escalation. And if you compare the numbers of rockets that have been launched this time versus in previous years, 2014, 2012, you will see that I think the number of rockets that were launched in all of the entire conflict from 2014, they've done it in just 3 days in this round. So, and the reason for that, one guess is that they want to see if the Iron Dome can be overwhelmed. The Iron Dome is what gives Israel leverage. It is what protects Israeli residents from the rocket attacks, and it is what allows Israel to sort of continue with everyday life, maintain a sense of normalcy, even as the defense forces or the security establishment deals with Hamas and rocket fire, etc., especially in the center and in the north. So, but the Iron Dome, while it is an excellent system, a missile defense system, and while it has been very effective in keeping the calm or keeping the illusion of calm, it has its limitations. We don't know what those limitations are or where those limitations begin. Specifically, the Iron Dome can intercept only X number of rockets. If you overwhelm the system with more, then it is not able to intercept all of it, which means that some of them will fall through, some of them will hit, civilian targets in Israel. And that is something that obviously becomes problematic. And this is what Hamas has been trying to do, to see if they can over what they don't have in quality, if they can make up in quantity. Although from the Israeli civilian whose house just got hit, they don't care what quality rocket hit the house. Their house was destroyed. We have had casualties as well. We have an elderly citizen who passed away, a child who was killed, and of course, you must have heard it. There was an Indian citizen who was killed in the first day, I believe, and I believe Santosh Sivam, she was the only. She's still the only foreign citizen who has been killed in this current round of fighting. I believe her body was just taken back to India. She has a husband and a 9-year-old child back home. And, when something like this happened, it really, truly does hit very close to home. Not to say that Israeli lives don't matter. Of course they do. But, when as an Indian citizen, as a foreign citizen in this country, when you hear of another Indian citizen being hit like this, it hits you closer in that sense. It was quite disturbing for me. And yes, and she was a caregiver. A lot of Indians here are caregivers, and many of them do live in the southern cities, which really bear the brunt of Hamas's rocket fire. So yeah, this is sort of how things have been. Interestingly, though, in Jerusalem, things have been quieter in terms of rocket fire. The first day on Monday, there was one rocket fire, and that is what really sort of set that's what sort of got the ball rolling. 6 p.m., I remember I was going out for a walk, and suddenly there was a huge, loud siren, and it was very confusing at the time. And so there was that. But since then, there has been no rocket fire into Jerusalem. I don't think they hit anything in Jerusalem. It fell in an open area, but it's very rare for Hamas to target Jerusalem, in part because of, the whole thing about Hamas being the protector of the Muslim sites in Jerusalem, and in part because it's harder to hit Jerusalem. Jerusalem is on a higher elevation. It's harder to target in that sense. But what we've had in Jerusalem, though, is continuous localized violence in the Arab neighborhoods, particularly in the East Jerusalem neighborhoods around the old city, outside of Damascus Gate, which is the entrance to the Muslim quarter of the old city, and violence in those areas have continued. It's localized. So if you're in the center of the city, for example, you really don't feel it. But for example, I live on Mount Scopus, which is sort of like an Jewish enclave surrounded by Arab villages and Arab villages of East Jerusalem, and we constantly hear police sirens, ambulance sirens, stun grenades, that sort of thing. So you know that there is, even though even you don't feel it, you know that what's going on in those areas. But it's still very localized, I have to say. And also, since the violence that happened before Eid at Al-Aqsa, since then, in the last 2-3 days, things have been relatively quiet. I believe Eid prayers were offered peacefully. Several hundreds of Muslims, went to Al-Aqsa to offer their prayers, and there were no problems. So, in a sense, things have quietened down in Israel, even though it started with events in this city. But now, the conflict has sort of taken on a completely different, completely different nature, so to say. So what started with very specific Jerusalem-related issues has now, or Palestinians in Jerusalem-related issues, has now become a bigger Hamas versus Israel. And then we have also had riots all over the country, Arab-Israeli riots in Israeli cities, either mixed cities, which have both Jewish and Arab populations, like Haifa, Lod, Ramle, etc., Jaffa, and also in Arab majority cities or cities that have only Arab populations, like Al-Fam in the north and a couple of other places, also Nazareth. So this is rare. This is not something we have seen, at least on this scale, in at least the past 20 years. I believe the last one was the October 2000 riots between Jewish and Arab citizens or residents of Israel, within Israel proper. So this has been quite worrying, and there have been attacks on both sides. Arabs have attacked Jewish synagogues and set afire Jewish cars and drivers and that sort of thing. And on the other side, you have had Jewish extremists attacking Arab families, Arab individuals, houses, restaurants, that sort of thing. A man was lynched on live television. I don't think I've seen anything like that before. So that has been particularly worrisome. There were those riots within the country, because to me it seems like that is also something that is probably more worrisome to me than what's happening with Hamas and Gaza, because at the end of the day, with Hamas, we know how this is going to play out, more or less. It's a fixed template. It happens every couple of years. We know how this is going to play out. And there isn't really a long-term solution in that sense. So it's one of those things that you just sort of go through the motions, right? But with the riots inside the country, that is something more worrisome, because it really goes to the social fabric of Israeli society. I will not pretend that Arabs and Jews in this country are best of friends. They're not, but in a lot of places, they do manage to live peacefully side by side. Maybe there's not a lot of social interaction or personal interaction, but we go to university together, we go to work together. So in the professional fields, there's a reasonably high level of integration. Certain specific fields like medicine and healthcare, for example, Arabs are represented in a much higher percentage compared to their own presence in the population. Personally, not so much. You don't hear of a lot of Arab-Jewish marriages, for example. They mostly live, even in mixed cities, they mostly live in separate neighborhoods. But overall, there is peace and quiet. And this round of violence really sort of, brings out a lot of those sort of anxieties or sort of the negative feelings that a lot of people had put behind them or, put aside. It brings those out. especially say, for example, if you lived through the second Intifada. As a Jewish person, if you lived through the second Intifada, when you remember bombs going off and buses going off and that sort of thing, there is that somewhere at the back of your mind, you're still distrustful a little bit of your Arab neighbors and that sort of thing. And then something like this happens and you're like, see, we told you this is not. And this goes both ways. Okay. I mean, I'm giving one side of it. It's true both ways. One part of this problem is because of the way is with law and order enforcement, particularly in the Arab cities and in the poorer cities like Ramle and Lod, which are also mixed cities. Police enforcement has been a problem. Law and order enforcement has been a problem. These are heavily under-policed cities. And in fact, there have been demands from Arab residents in the past to increase police presence. From the police point of view, they're like, hey, we don't want to get into a mess. That's not the way to deal with these issues, but that's the way the police will often look at it. So if there is because otherwise, if you look at Jewish towns in Israel, if you look at Tel Aviv, you look at Jerusalem, Rishon, etc., crime rates, everyday crime rates, murder, gang, that sort of thing, are very low. There is very little crime in that sense. And that's because these cities are properly policed and law and order is maintained. Arab sector, the police is much less reluctant to enforce law and order. So what happens is that over the past years, you've had gang violence, you have had these local criminal networks emerge. And, so then when something like this happens, these people are already there on the ground. And then, they sort of flame the fires further and, they add a communal element or a communal flavor to the ongoing mess. So even if the average person is just, sitting in their homes hoping that things don't get worse, you have these criminal elements on the streets who are setting things ablaze and attacking synagogues and mosques and restaurants and whatnot. So there is so you see two elements here again, with the policing issue, as well as deeper social distrust, call it, the actual, so the things that where Arab Jewish relations were really improving within the country, but now you feel like we have to see how this, if it really sets things back or if it's communities can overcome. I mean, on the plus side, there have been a lot of sort of very grassroots level response and to this particular sort of violence. A lot of Jewish and Arab community leaders have come together and they've demonstrated together, peace demonstrations, and they've had meetings to make sure that things are quiet. So that's definitely something to also keep in mind, that there is pushback from decent people, if you want to put it that way. Yes, I think that's sort of where we are at the moment in terms of societal relations. So.
All right. No, that's a lot to break down, and it sounds like sort of a difficult time everywhere. And so I think, it's important to just take a step back and say, okay, what happened last week with Al-Aqsa Mosque? Can you give us sort of like just a primer so that we understand sort of why this conflict erupted?
So I'll tell you what happened at Al-Aqsa and why at least the Hamas firing is actually not linked to Al-Aqsa. Mm-hmm. So what happened was from the very beginning, Ramadan or Ramzan, the Israeli police made a very basic tactical error. They blocked Arab entrance to there's a plaza, there's a set of steps right outside Damascus Gate. These stairs or plaza, this area is very important to the Arab community. They meet here during Ramzan. They have their iftari over there, and it's a very sacred place. And access to that area is important to them. The police blocked access to that area. This was a strategic mistake on their end. This should not have been done. But Israel police blocked. They just put barricades in that area and blocked it. So that led to the first set of clashes in that area. And then eventually they removed it and they put it back again. And then, there's this sort of back and forth. And that's sort of what led to the eruption of violence. And then, of course, You had the violence in the mosque itself. And the mosque itself, the violence was sort of both ways. You had Israeli police going in and clearing out protesters. And of course, within the mosque, you had protesters who had already stockpiled weapons inside the mosque. So you had, a whole bunch of stones and that sort of thing being stockpiled within the mosque, Molotov cocktails, etc., etc. So it was honestly a mess on both sides. And again, some people have said that the initial response of the Israel police, even with regard to Al-Aqsa, was heavy-handed. Some of it could be local politics. The current two police commissioners are new, and they're mostly border police. They don't really have a lot of experience with this sort of thing. So that could explain this sort of tactical mess. But in the Middle East, even as what could be a tactical mess can lead to regional conflict, as we know. So this is sort of what happened with the Al-Aqsa issue. Two other issues sort of came in and that one difficult weekend, which was the Sheikh Jarrah case, where you had in East Jerusalem, there's a district called Sheikh Jarrah. You have Palestinian residents there, and they are being evicted from their homes. It's depending on how you see it, it's a land property dispute to some extent. The Jewish appellants, they say that this is, land that they own, but the residents say that no, this is our house, this is where we have lived. So that's a very basic one-line introduction to that problem, but it's a court case that's been going on for a very, very long time. It has its roots in the 1948 war, and if you want, we can go back to that a little bit. But for now, so that was there, and there was the court was supposed to make a ruling on that in that case. So there were tensions were heightened because of that. And then on Jerusalem Day, Israelis celebrate the unification of East and West Jerusalem. Specifically, they celebrate the fact that with the unification, they now have access to the Western Wall. Because before 1967, when Jordan controlled the area, Israelis did not have access to the Western Wall. So that's what they celebrate, that with the reunification, they now have access to their most holy place. One of the most important things that happened on Jerusalem Day is that there is a procession or a march. It's called the March of the Flags, from the city center towards the old city to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, and that march goes through Damascus Gate, which is, as I mentioned, the entry to the Muslim quarter. There is a lot of sloganeering, and sometimes this march can be very provocative on both sides. The Jewish demonstrators often chant very provocative, very ugly slogans, and the Arabs on the other side respond in kind. There's violence also sometimes. So there was that march, which was expected. And when you add to that the already existing tensions because of Sheikh Jarrah, because of past, already the violence that had been happening through the early weeks of Ramadan. So it was all sort of kind of coming together. And that's sort of where we were in terms of the background to this conflict up until Monday. Last Monday was Jerusalem Day. So the common narrative has been that because of all these things and because of Israeli brutalities at Al-Aqsa, etc., Hamas thought it was necessary to respond with the rockets. This, in my opinion, is a flawed connection. Hamas responded because it just wanted to piggyback on the issue and it needed some. So it did so for its own political motives. It had nothing to do, in my opinion, with what was happening at Al-Aqsa, what was happening at Damascus Gate. And I'll tell you why. Because if you look at it with respect to these particular events, the Palestinians won this round of fighting. Okay. And I say this because with Sheikh Jarrah, the Israeli government pressured the courts to postpone the hearing. Now, it's a long hearing. It's, so you won't suddenly get a sort of a ruling that is pro one side or anti other side, whatever, but at least a postponement in this situation, in this little box, is a victory. So they were able to postpone the ruling. With the march, also, Netanyahu was able to pressure the leaders or the organizers of the march to change their route and not go through Damascus Gate, but I think go through Jaffa Gate, which is the next gate, and less controversial in that sense. But once he changed the route, and this happened absolutely last minute, I believe, like the march was about to begin at 5 p.m. And then at 5 p.m. they said, okay, we have changed the route. And so when they changed the route, the organizer said, you know what, if you don't let us go through Damascus Gate, we're not interested in going at all. So eventually the march that part of the march was cancelled. There were celebrations at the hotel at Western Wall, and there were other events. But this particular thing, which was the most provocative aspect of the celebrations, that was cancelled. So that was again a Palestinian victory, and this was done totally, because of pressures from the Palestinian street. And so this was another victory, and also with the restrictions to Bab Mahmoud, the plaza in front of Damascus Gate, those restrictions were eventually removed. So, I mean, if you break it up and you see the smaller things, the Palestinian street managed its own victories by itself, without Hamas, without anyone doing anything on its own, just by its own method, using its own methods of resistance, etc. They managed. And I will say that, especially if you look at it from Netanyahu's point of view, or from the Israeli political point of view, changing the route of the procession especially was a big concession, if you want to put it that way. Remember that Netanyahu is not in a politically comfortable position. He desperately needs the support of his extreme right-wing allies, and for them this is a very important ideological issue. And the fact that he was willing to push them back on this really, it's a huge. People see it as it's a concession, and so it was a big deal, especially given the situation where Netanyahu is fighting for his political survival. You have someone also. Another thing was this: the member of Knesset, Itamar Ben Gvir, who is this very right-wing Kahanist politician, who was brought in because Netanyahu needed more right-wing, extremist right-wing support. And he is one of those very extremist right-wing Jewish politicians. He had, in fact, in the middle of all of this, set up his office in Sheikh Jarrah. So you can imagine the kind of explosive situation that had created, right? Like he had put his table, chair, office in Sheikh Jarrah, and of course his supporters were there, and it was, emotions are running high, and so it was quite a flashpoint over there, and Netanyahu convinced him to retreat. Okay, so that was also another smaller dynamic at play, and so you see all of this, and so my point is that on Monday, once the march was cancelled, all of these things had fallen into place. Right? And at each point you see that the Palestinian street had won on their own merit, just by their own, devices of resistance or whatever, they had won. So there was no good reason for Hamas then to launch a rocket at 6 p.m. on Monday into Jerusalem. But they did it to piggyback on the ongoing, issues, and for their own political game. And that is because, as you may have heard, there was supposed to be an election with the Palestinian Authority. They were supposed to have their first, as they say, Mahmoud Abbas is in the 13th year or something of his 5-year term. So they keep postponing their elections. And so there was supposed to be an election this month. And again, those elections were postponed. And so, there is a growing sense that the Fatah party and the Palestinian Authority is weak, and Hamas is constantly making bids to take over political power in that region. So this was their way to to make a mark and say like, hey, guess what? We're still here. We're still in business, man. Like to make their presence felt. And so yes, and which is why you see this huge round of this new round of conflict. So yes, that's sort of where we are.
Yeah, so I think what happened was that Hamas fired rockets at Israel, and then the Israeli Defense Force retaliated, and then I think a number of Hamas leaders died, particularly after one building collapsed in Gaza, and now you have sort of like casualties, particularly in Gaza, mounting. Right. So I think that's sort of where the current state is. And I'm just wondering, since you mentioned this repeatedly, that I want to go back into history. And I know that that would take more than, of course, an hour of our time and sort of discussing the roots of that. But before, since we're still talking about Hamas, earlier you'd said with Hamas, we know how this is going to play out. And I was just wondering what you meant by that.
Right. So 2008, 2012, 2014, we have seen this same template, right? Hamas will fire rockets for whatever their own political, there's always a political backdrop to this, right? So they have their own political calculations. It's either rooted in Palestinian politics, sometimes a response to Israeli politics. And so yes, so they will fire rockets into Israel. Israel has a threshold for what is acceptable, what is not. Israel will retaliate, and eventually this will go on for 7 days, 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever. And then eventually the foreign powers will come in, Egypt, Jordan, maybe the US. There will be some sort of ceasefire negotiation. It's the same thing right now, right? Like Hamas started with the rockets, Israel responded. Israel will respond till it feels that, it has responded adequately. Hamas is continuing to also fire rockets as well. And this is going to go on for a while till either they run out of rockets or there is some sort of mediation. Mediation efforts are on already. There's a delegation from Egypt that I believe is in Tel Aviv at the moment. It's the same cycle every time. No one wins, no one loses. Innocent civilians die on both sides. More in Gaza, of course, and that is entirely on Hamas. I know some people like to have a sort of both sides take on this. I have not a both sides take on this, and I'm very clear on this that for Gazan deaths, Hamas is responsible, and I take a very strong position on that for the simple reason that I believe that if Hamas can, just like the Israeli government, you may or may not like its policies on Palestine and this and that and overall, but the fact is that the Israeli government invests to protect and defend its citizens, its interests. Hamas may or may not like Israel, may or may not like Israeli policies, the government, etc. But there's nothing that's stopping Hamas from protecting its own citizens. If it can build tunnels for its own people, it can also build bomb shelters for its own people. Right? How are there fewer Israeli casualties? Because Israel has invested in the Iron Dome, and every single Israeli building has a bomb shelter or a reinforced apartment that serves as a bomb shelter. Right? That's how you prevent casualties, or that's how you reduce the numbers. Hamas can do the same for its people, but it chooses not to, because more people that die in Gaza, that's their publicity tool. Oh, look how bad the Israeli government is. They're killing innocent Gazan babies. Oh, look how terrible all of this is. You know what? Then don't operate out of Gazan schools, don't operate out of Gazan hospitals and buildings if you don't want these to be attacked. And even then, when Israel does conduct these attacks, and I think this is something that a lot of people probably miss, is that these are knock on the roof attacks, right? So Israel informs the residents that your building is going to be attacked, leave now. And these are almost always empty buildings that are then brought down, right? Because Israel doesn't really care about the buildings. It's usually what's under the buildings, which are your tunnels and the hidden safe rooms. That is what Israel is attacking. And over the years, Israel has really improved its targeted precision attack abilities. You will see this on the net. taking out, like Israel can specifically target a particular apartment in the whole building and just take out that apartment, and the building still stands. Of course, in this case, we have seen Israel taking out entire buildings, banks specifically have been targeted, military headquarters, wherever Israel has information that Hamas is hiding rockets and ammunition, etc. So does that mean that people don't die? And that's still, yes, of course, there are casualties, and that's horrible. And in fact, just today, I believe, in one of the refugee camps in Gaza, there was an attack that killed 8 babies. The attack was targeting a specific Hamas leader. I'm not sure if he was eventually taken out, but in that attack, 8 babies were killed. And, to the parents of those children and to the lives lost, it doesn't matter, right? All of this conflict, all of this politics, doesn't matter, right? Every life lost is a tragedy, and it's horrible. And I don't know what sort of decision-making processes went into in the selection of the target, but it happens. Mistakes happen. Calculations go wrong. Intelligence is mistaken, and innocent civilians die on both sides. What makes it worse is that on the Gazan side, Hamas does nothing to protect its citizens. If anything, it constantly uses its citizens as human shields. It uses its citizens for its own propaganda. And so that's why the numbers on that side are so much higher. And even on the Israeli side, you see that Israel has put in defenses, bomb shelters, Iron Dome, etc. But when you overwhelm the Iron Dome, which is what Hamas is trying to do this year, in this round, there are casualties, even on the Israeli side.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That I think that you have like one set of views on it, because I have heard people who take sort of the both sides, as well as the fact of how bad the humanitarian crisis is in Israel. And I think, how do you sort of think about it? Because a lot of people do think about this in binaries, to say either Israel is right in doing what it does, or Palestine is right in the way Hamas responds. And so it makes me wonder. About I guess it goes back to sort of what the root of the crisis is, and I guess that's sort of about the existence of both states in a sense, right? So you have to go back straight to 1948 with it. How do you think about that?
So in terms of the humanitarian crisis, I don't think anybody has said that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is fake. Okay. It's horrible. Like, life in Gaza is horrible. It's a very difficult existence. There's no doubt about that. But I think it is made worse, not so much by Israeli policies, but by Hamas's presence and the way Hamas chooses to govern the area. At the end of the day, if you look at it, there are 2 ways to look at this, and I think both are legitimate. One is that Israel does not have a presence in Gaza. There is not a single Israeli soldier or civilian, or a Jewish soldier or civilian in Gaza Strip, right? So that area is completely their own. It's entirely Hamas's business, however Hamas manages it. So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is, yes, Israel controls the Gazan airspace. It controls entry and exit points, but so does Egypt, right? So there's an entry point into Gaza from Israel, and there's one from Egypt, the Rafah crossing, which is also closed. And nobody blames Egypt for making Gaza a open air prison. I mean, Gaza has problems with Israel. Okay, so that crossing is closed, but Egypt can open the crossing if it wants. But Egypt also keeps that crossing closed because Hamas uses it to smuggle arms and weapons from Egypt. Okay, so again, as you see repeatedly, it's Hamas that is, at least in my opinion, that is the problem here when it comes to the specific situation of the Gazan population. And the Gaza Strip receives a lot of international funding. Instead of using that to make weapons that can fire, that can be fired at Israeli civilians and Israeli cities, you can invest that in building schools and hospitals and infrastructure for Gazans. But Hamas chooses not to do that. And I also think that this narrative that because Israel oppresses us, Hamas responds with rockets. That's a very broad narrative. And, we can go into the question of, what do you mean by Israel oppresses us? Like oppression, or Israeli control in the West Bank is one thing, Israeli control, oppression, policies, etc. In Gaza Strip is a different ballgame. These are very different conversations to be had. But when you make this broad stroke argument about Israeli oppression against Palestinians, and therefore Hamas is responding with rockets, I think I would really ask, like, have you spoken with Gazans and asked if they want to attack Israeli cities, knowing full well how Israel will retaliate? I mean, of course, you don't expect Israel to sit around and do nothing. Of course, Israel will retaliate. We know this. And Hamas knows it. And yet Hamas takes this particular strategy. I mean, if you have a problem, if you don't like Israeli policies in a certain way, there are many ways to fight the fight, right? But when you choose this particular route, where you are specifically targeting not Israeli military headquarters or not just Israeli soldiers, you're specifically indiscriminately targeting Israeli cities, Israeli civilians, of course there is a response from the Israeli side, right? And no matter what Israel does in terms of these knock on the roof attacks, etc., informing people in advance, blah blah blah. Of course, there are casualties on the ground. What do you expect? When a whole building comes down, of course there'll be some casualties, right? And I don't think an ordinary Gazan would take this strategy, even if they don't approve of Israeli policies, etc. And there are other ways to fight this fight. But when you take this road, you are making it very clear that we want dead Gazans, because you know what? Dead Gazans make for good publicity. And that is where like, to the extent when I say that I don't take both sides are equally to blame sort of approach. It's in this specific context.
Fair enough. So take us a little bit back in history, maybe to sort of the founding of Israel. And briefly, can you walk us through sort of the main aspects in this conflict? Because it does go back 70 odd years.
Right, of course. Okay, I'll frame this in a way that I hope will be able to sort of feed into the current conflict. But I will add that, of course, it's a very complicated, complex situation. There are lots of different factors and forces that go into it. And, some of it is, and the way I choose my facts, or what I choose to present, the way I frame it, that, of course, is the result of, of the way I choose to do it, and someone else might do it in a completely different way. And I'm completely open to, and I'm just saying that I'm aware that I am presenting one narrative and that there are other narratives, and this is often a battle of the narratives. But I will try to sort of, as much as possible, bring out all sides, and also I'll try to make some comparisons with the Indian subcontinent for our Indian, since this is an Indian audience, and we'll see how that works. And if you think that the analogy doesn't work, do tell me also. So what happens in 48 is that the British partition the region, historic Palestine, into two states in a very similar manner that the British partitioned the Indian subcontinent into India, Pakistan, and eventually Bangladesh. At that time, so basically two states were formed, but because the Palestinians did not accept the state at the time, till date they don't have a state. They were offered a state in 48. They didn't like it, they rejected it, and have since then continued to reject whatever offers that have been made, and specifically they've continued to reject the existence of an Israeli state. Now, the issues of, okay, is the Israeli state justified? Who gave the British the right to partition the area, right? To my mind, these are excellent academic questions, but in practicality, to me, it means nothing. Because at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, just as the British ruled India and decided on the contours of partition in 47, they ruled Palestine as well, in a slightly different manner. In India, they were 100% the sovereign. In Palestine, they weren't quite the sovereign. They were protected. They had a mandate, not which is like sovereignty light. But again, academic differences. Basically, the British were the boss on both sides, and when they left, this was what they left us with. In both cases, even like in India, also in India with India Pakistan, if we didn't like the exact contours of the borders, we fought about it a little bit. Kashmir, Goa, for example, we added later this and that. So we did a little bit of rejigging with Bangladesh, right? So, okay, you don't like the exact contours of the border, we fight around to fix that. But the basic idea, right, of two states, two sovereign states was accepted by leaders on both sides in India, Pakistan. Here it wasn't. And that, I think, remains the fundamental problem. And not only did they not accept what was given, they also then rejected the existence of a Jewish state. And they were not able to, in subsequent attempts, secure a state for themselves. If hypothetically, let's say history had gone a different way, and if they had been able to defeat the Jewish nation, or let's say the Jewish leaders of the time had not been able to build a functional state or something of that sort, it's a different story. That would have been a different story. But it didn't work like that, right? So the Jews were given whatever state, they also did not like what they were given, okay? They also felt that they were shortchanged and they didn't get what they wanted. They weren't 48, they didn't have control over Jerusalem, didn't have control over the Negev. Of course, Golan was with Syria, of course. It was a tiny state, indefensible. If I were Ben Gurion, I'd be like, what the hell? This state, it's not going to work. It cannot survive, right? But the Jews took whatever was given to them, and they eventually made it work by means both fair and foul. You had the wars of 48, you had the war of 67, etc. So there was that. On the Palestinian side, there's been a consistent stream of rejectionism. Their belief that this is a homeland that is only for the Arabs and the Jews don't have a place in this land is, I mean, to me, it seems, especially in 2021, it seems pointless. Even today, if you ask Hamas, what do you want? Do you want to sit at a table with Netanyahu and talk to them about peace? No, they want the Jewish state gone. 9 million people are not just going to go away. The state of Israel exists, whether some people like it or not. Right. And so you have to be realistic about it and, work with that. We cannot go back to 47, 48. And even before that, there's this thing that the British or the Western world gave Israel to the Jews as a gift to make up for the losses of the Holocaust. It's a very convenient narrative. It's not true at all, in fact, because the first Aliyah, the first group of Jewish people who moved to Palestine, to mandatory Palestine, Ottoman Palestine, actually, were moved in 1881 or 83, early 1880s, right? So this is before World War II. This is before World War I. So this is when the first Aliyah happened. These were the first of the Jews who came back to Israel with a view of setting up a Jewish state, or at some point design the old Yishuv, what's called the old Yishuv, so etc. So then again, this whole thing about the Jews just came from Europe and they don't have a right to this land. That's also not a fair and complete holistic narrative in that sense. I mean, yes, there were Jews who came from Europe, and they're still coming from the US. In the 1990s, you had the whole wave of Jews who came from Russia after the collapse, around this time that the Soviet Union collapsed, etc. But the point is that even if even without going back 2,000 years to the time of the first temple and the first Jewish state, etc., even in more recent history, Jews have been in this land, and they are as much settlers in this land as much as the Arabs. The Arabs also came from Arabia and settled in these lands, right? So they are also not, depending on how far you want to go back, they're also not 100% of this land in that sense, right? And but that doesn't mean that today they don't have a right to live. Today both of them do, and especially with 47, 48, there was most certainly displacement of the Arab population, and some of, depending on what narrative you want to go with, some fled, some were pushed out. I believe that the truth, as always, lies in between. A little bit of both happened. There were massacres and ugly massacres on both sides. If there were, just on the day that the partition plan was approved in the UN, that very day, same evening, you had riots, Arab riots against the Jews. There was a convoy, for example, that was coming to here, to right here where I live right now, to Hadassah, and that was blown up. And of course, on the reverse, also there were Jewish attacks on Arab towns, and there was a famous plan, Toknit Dalet, it's called Plan D, about what to do with the Arab population. Once in the 48 war, once the Israeli army started being able to establish control over the state that it had been given, there was a lot of conversation about what do we do with the Arabs. They're not our friends. They're hostile to us. So what do we do with them? Can we push them out? Can we? What happened? Some of them fled, some of them were pushed out, some of them were allowed to stay, which is why you have mixed cities in Israel, Haifa being a good example of a big Israeli city, which is a mixed city. So, and yes, and in that, and this again sort of feeds into the Sheikh Jarrah controversy that you have today, is that the land that is currently, in Sheikh Jarrah, it's Jewish land, because in terms of the land is actually owned by Jewish people, but the people who live in there, the houses belong to the Arabs, and that's because the Jews owned the land. During 48, they were kicked out, so they had to give up their land and move away. And then 67, when Israel takes over the region, they're told, okay, fine, if those who were kicked out of those areas are allowed to come back. But when they come back, you see that there are other people who have lived there and whose houses are there. So, and also there's this issue of I'm not going to go into the legal issues because this is completely outside of my purview, but there is a legal issue about both Jordan and Israel, because Jordan controlled these lands between 48 and 67, the issue with enemy possessions, right? You have this even with India, Pakistan, I believe. In India also, there are some properties now that were enemy properties that lie abandoned because they have unresolved property disputes in that sense. So you have the same thing with both in Israel and Jordan. And Jordan also did the same thing, like the properties that were abandoned in that sense, it tried to parcel away to Arab families, and then and Israel did the same. But in 67, when Israel took over those lands, then you had people who had left in 48. Now you can bring them back, but already other people live there. It's a mess. And then there's a lot of documents, like whose documents, British era documents, Ottoman era documents, who owned this land, who has the deeds. There's a reason why this has been in court for a very long time. This is not to say, though, that, and I'll make 2 points on Sheikh Jarrah again, which connects to, comes from the issues of 1948. One was that during this ongoing court case, the Arab residents were offered a settlement. They were told that you pay rent and you can live in these houses as protected residents. They refused. Okay. Now, I will, I'm not going to speak for them, but to me, that seems like, what else do you want out of this, right? You're being told you can stay, but their point is, no, this is our home. Why should we pay rent? Okay, but they're like, oh, but this is our land. That's why you pay rent, because you don't own the land. So, it's a little complicated, and it depends again on how you want to play this. So that's one aspect of the Sheikh Jarrah specific to this current ongoing dispute. The other side also is that Israel, and specifically certain organizations within Israel, have specifically pursued policies, even today, of expulsion of Arab families from East Jerusalem. Okay. There are very complicated rules and laws about this, who is a resident, who's a permanent resident. You can lose residency if you're not in the country for X number of years. There are lots of complications in that sense, and they use that a lot to expel Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem. There is a definite effort to Judaize the area. So there is that, our strand of thought. On the other side, again, there's also the issue of citizenship. For example, the residents of East Jerusalem are not Israeli citizens. Unlike, say, the residents of the other Arab cities and towns in Israel proper, there are Arabs who are Israeli citizens. In East Jerusalem, most of them are not citizens, and for the longest they can apply for citizenship, but for the longest time it was a very difficult process. It still is a very difficult process. It's hard to get Israeli citizenship. Firstly, Arabs in these areas are reluctant to apply for citizenship. It's considered as a bit of a, that you are giving up on the struggle and you're conceding, and it's considered a bit of a sellout. So there's community pressure also not to apply for Israeli citizenship. And when you do apply for Israeli citizenship, it's a hard process and often you don't get citizenship. But if you look at the numbers, both the number of applications have risen as well as the number of people who are being given citizenship have also risen. So you have these seemingly contradictory narratives, but they're both true if you look at just the facts. So certain Israeli organizations, settler organizations, there is a push to Judaize the area and push out the Arab residents, take over more and more, or you have two Arab settlements or villages or neighborhoods, and in between you authorize the construction of a new Israeli establishment or settlement, right? So then that connection breaks. And eventually, someday, when you have if and when you have a Palestinian state, then there you go. You have this, sore fingers or thumb of a Jewish settlement stuck in between. What will you do with that? So you see what I'm saying? So there's one side, there's this, and on the other side, you see that the citizenship numbers tell you a very different kind of story. So like I said, it's a complicated narrative and individual, and what happens at the individual level is different from what happens at the society. And even within Arabs, I keep saying Arabs, but really there's a lot of difference between West Bank Arabs, Gazan Arabs, Arabs in East Jerusalem, Arabs in Arab towns who are full Israeli citizens, and a specific group of Arabs in the north, in the Golan, older Arabs, who were Syrian citizens at one point. Their children maybe also, who also were given the option of Israeli citizenship, who chose not to take Israeli citizenship. Specifically in the Golan, there's a smaller community of Arabs there who have chosen not to. And Israel has controlled the Golan since 1967. Now, so obviously, if you were a baby in 1967, you're an old person at this point. So there are now generations of Syrian Arabs in those areas who have never known a life in Syria, and of course, with the events of the last 10 years, realistically, there's no going back, right? So you have more and more younger people from there who are willing to take up Israeli citizenship. The older people, I think, still hold on to their Syrian citizenship. There are some complications over there. Arab citizens of Israel are, again, their own, they have their own politics and their own they are a different bunch. Those in the West Bank are different. Their politics don't always match with what's happening. And you see that, just to give you a small example, the leader of the Ram coalition, the Arab coalition, he made a very interesting statement saying that to Hamas, that don't try and incite the Arab population within Israel They have their own representatives. They have elected us. We are democratically elected representatives of the people here. We will deal with their problems, whatever it is, whether it's with the Israeli government or whatever, we will deal with that. You keep your, dirty fingers out of this sort of thing. So again, and you see those difference, and even East Jerusalem Arabs, they have their own politics. They're not always on the same page with, say, the West Bank Arabs, who have their, because they are under the PA. East Jerusalem is really the ones that really, really have it bad. I mean, probably the only ones that are worse than them are the ones in Gaza, because East Jerusalem is really sort of that, that child that belongs to no one in that sense. It doesn't really come under the control of the PA. It's under Israeli control, but trust me, I live walking distance from East Jerusalem. I often go there to shop and stuff. And in Israel, there's talk of a united Jerusalem. As anyone that has lived in this area will tell you, it is most certainly not united in any way. Like the buses, buses that run in West Jerusalem don't go into East Jerusalem. And East Jerusalem buses, the Arab buses, don't come into West Jerusalem. So the bus card, my Ravkav, which I use in West Jerusalem, and I can use all over the country, on the train, whatever, I cannot use it in East Jerusalem. But East Jerusalem is a particularly, how should I put it, a sensitive point. Precisely because you feel like it's been screwed from, it's had it bad from all sides. West Jerusalem, if you're an Arab in the West Bank, at least you have representation through the Palestinian Authority. Whether or not you like their politics or not is a different issue. They have their own issues with corruption and leaders who, who are weak, whatever. They have their own set of issues, but at least they have some sort of representation, and you feel like, okay, I'm an Arab and I live in an Arab state, and I have Arab representation. East Jerusalem residents really have it bad in that sense because they don't really have support from the West, from the PA, and the Israeli government has security control over the area, but really they're like, guys, you guys do what you want, man. Something as basic as a municipal service like garbage collection and you can see it. I walk, for 10 minutes into Wadi Jos, which is an East Jerusalem neighborhood from where I live. You can immediately, you'll feel the difference in the standard of living. So yes, I completely lost.
No, it's definitely, I think, important to sort of see like a basic everyday living situation, because all of this boils down to that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, Mayuri, sort of like before we wind up, why I understand like sort of citizenship of like Golden Heights being like different, but is there a reason why you make the distinction between like Arabs and Palestinians in that sense when you talk about sort of like Arabs or like mixed cities or things like that?
Actually, no, I don't think. I mean, I'm sorry if it came across that way, but I when I use the terms, I've mostly used them interchangeably. Usually but if I had to write an academic paper or sorts, I would probably make the difference in that Palestinians are those who would not have Israeli citizenship, but are of Arab ethnicity or origin, whereas Arabs would be a more wide term that could include Israeli citizens and citizens of the future Palestinian state. But this is my distinction, and not everybody goes by this. A lot of people will use the term Palestinian even for Arab citizens of Israel. So they're called Israeli Palestinians or Palestinian Israelis, like that. So, this is my distinctions on the basis of, what makes sense to me. But yeah, in terms of citizenship, and I think this citizenship distinction is important because it tells you much about the local politics of this and whose interests lie where. And for example, often when we discuss about Israeli-Palestinian peace plans and what could a future Palestinian state look like, you often hear of these things that, oh, okay, we will keep, the Jews will keep, or Israel will keep Ma'ale Adumim, which is like this Jewish settlement on the other side of the Green Line, on the opposite side of 67. And in return, the Arabs will get, there's this Arab triangle in the north, maybe they will get those towns over there. And you see that there is a sort of like a response to that no, we don't want that. The Arabs, we are citizens of Israel, we want to be, right? So there are these, when the PA was formed, and at that time when Bethlehem, for example, went under Palestinian Authority control, before that it was under Israeli control, there was, the population was majority Christian, minority Muslim. And from what I've heard is that they did not want to be moved to the Palestinian Authority. They wanted, even though they were Arabs, they wanted to live under Israeli control, but the way things worked out at the time, Bethlehem went under Palestinian control, under the PA, and you see that the demographic change in Bethlehem. Again, why that has happened? It's not like, no one's saying that there have been pogroms or anything of that sort. I mean, some have left, others felt compelled to leave, maybe. Again, it depends on who you talk to, it's a complicated narrative again, but the numbers themselves, don't lie, and you see the demographic change in that area, just sort of to add another strand to our conversation. But yeah.
Sure. No, it's definitely interesting. And finally, there's a question that I ask all of my guests, Mayuri, but like, what books or what resources would you recommend for anyone who wants to read more about the Israel-Palestine conflict, particularly now?
I would say read Benny Morris's book, Righteous Victims. If I had to pick one book, I think that is the one that I would pick. He's an Israeli author, an Israeli professor of history, but he's of the new generation of professors, and they're called the new historians. And they were the ones that really gave us a new, or a more holistic view, specifically of the 1948 war, and with the refugee crisis and all of that. Because before that in Israel, there used to be a very one-sided narrative that we were a state, we were given the state, 48, we were attacked, we did what we had to do to save ourselves. The Palestinians are bad, they tried to kill us, they tried to hurt us, we have to do what we have to do to defend us. So there's a very one-sided narrative. Yes, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a lot to sort of like watch out for. And hopefully things will get better soon. But thank you, Mayuri. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been very, very insightful.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have had this opportunity to speak with you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. That brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. Mayuri's recommendation, along with some of my own, are in the episode bio. Just a reminder that the recent wave in India is difficult on all of us, so mask up, get vaccinated, and stay home. If the pandemic is making you question the world, you can always ask for help. I answer listener questions about global affairs and foreign policy every fortnight on our special Q&A episode, so do send your questions across. You can email me at ivmstatesofanarchy@gmail.com. On Instagram, my handle is @statesofanarchy. On Twitter, I'm at HumsiniH. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM Podcast app or website, but also on Google Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Castbox, or wherever you're listening to me right now. Sending you lots of good vibes. I will be back next week.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Want to learn something new and have a few minutes to spare? Well, then go for the Traveling Professor's Diary, where I, Siddharth Deshmukh, the traveling professor, will help you glean from all the insights that I've gained from wherever I've traveled, learned, taught, and repeated. Join me every Tuesday and Thursday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts from.